Thank you all so much for joining. Feel free to engage as much or as little as you want. You can keep your cameras off. We will have a Q&A at the end of Rad's presentation, so feel free to pop any questions in the chat throughout the presentation if you want to, or else if you want to unmute yourself at the end, you are totally welcome to do so.
Alrighty. Okay. So now I'm just going to introduce Rad a little bit. He is the executive director of the Missoula Conservation District. Rad is a lifelong nature lover and conservationist based in Missoula, Montana, where he helps to protect local streams, wildlife, and working lands. He's been an aquatic invasive species coordinator and a lake management consultant. His career has taken him from the old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, studying endangered seabirds, to Glacier National Park collecting grizzly bear DNA, to the Northwoods of Wisconsin tracking wolves and rehabbing bald eagles. Brad also loves personal development and is a certified life coach who does leadership speaking and training. Brad is the creator of the Animal Leadership Personality Test and the book Animal Leadership: Leadership Lessons Learned from the Wildlife. Brad's talk today explores how we can learn from wildlife and wild habitats and as we strive to become better stewards of our waterways for future generations. All right, Rad, take it away.
All right. So let's see, where are we with screen sharing? Am I on?
hmm Go for it.
I still see your slide.
Oh yeah, we see
Oh,
you too.
let's see here. Are you able, did you click the screen share?
Sorry.
Um, Sorry. This will stop your screen sharing. We're all friends here, right? We can just
Yeah.
do you want to continue? It looks like I'll stop screen sharing, then I'll start screen sharing again.
Sounds
Perfect.
So
good.
how's that? What do you guys see?
We see
There we
your
go.
presentation.
All right,
Thanks,
cool.
guys.
Yeah, thank you for bearing with me here. In Zoom land, it's always something we have to deal with these days, but it brings us all together. Real fun. I see some familiar faces out there, and that's super cool for me. Um, because some people who are interested in this stuff are far away. So thank you everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. Today we're going to talk about the lessons from the river. We're going to talk about wild habitats, water, and then some local stewardship, how we deal with it here at the Missoula Conservation District, and just best management practices that you can do even if you have no regulatory authority. So I'm going to jump right in. And there we go. All right, so this is a map of North America, and these are some places I live. I have lived. This is Chicago, Illinois, which I was born and went to high school in the general Chicago area. I was lucky enough. Can you guys see my cursor when I move it around? Okay, so I was lucky enough to spend my summers in northern Wisconsin, where my grandparents had a cabin that was actually an island that they bought in the 40s. So it was pretty cool, filled with nature. As soon as I graduated, I basically wanted to be in a more wild place, moved to Boulder, Colorado for a little while, then hopped up here to Missoula, Montana. From Missoula, looking for environmental jobs, I moved to Seattle, Washington. Had a brief stint at Starbucks before I finally landed my big environmental gig with the Washington DNR and worked on the Olympic Peninsula studying marbled murrelets, which is a threatened seabird. From there, I moved back to northern Wisconsin because I decided I wanted to go to graduate school around my family. Got into graduate school in Houghton, Michigan, Michigan Tech, where I met my wife. And I spent my summers working on the Washburn Peninsula. And so after graduate school, my then girlfriend, Gretchen, went to Vermont and worked for the Vermont Department of Environmental Quality, I think it was. Um, and I went to Glacier and did some grizzly bear work. And then we both rendezvoused back at that island. And it was the second winter I spent on the island with no heat and running water, chopping a hole in the ice. But this time I had Gretchen, and that was a lot better. And then from there, we got married on the island and moved to Sandpoint, Idaho, and lived there for a little while before moving back to Wisconsin for 17 years, where we had kids and kind of raised them around family for most of their lives. And then 5 years ago, moved to Missoula, back to Missoula where I went to college. So that's my journey. The reason I mention it is because it was always pretty water rich. I mean, even Chicago is known as a very water rich city. You can see in this map of the lights of North America, Chicago stands out pretty well. You can kind of see the Great Lakes up here in these dark spots. It looks like there's more light than there is. It's pretty dark up here in northern Wisconsin. And then here would be Boulder, probably somewhere around here is Missoula, probably right there. And then Seattle and Olympic Peninsula. So the other cool thing about this is if you look at the forest cover of these watersheds, or the cover type, Seattle and Chicago are obviously developed, but these other places had a really forested watersheds. And that's important. Let's talk about watersheds for a minute, just to make sure everyone understands the term watershed. It's, we're all pretty much familiar with the continental divide. Water on this side goes to the Pacific, water on this side goes to the Atlantic, or often the Gulf if you're as far west as we are, or anywhere on the continental divide, I guess that's true. So every watershed has a divide, a ridge that divides it. And you can see on the right, there's precipitation coming down. Some of the water will go to the left, some of the water will go to the right. Ecologists use watersheds a lot, particularly in the Intermountain West and in the coastal mountains, just because they're so distinctive. You can see the ridge. What you have going on in that watershed makes a big difference to your water quality. And about the best thing you can have is a forested watershed, because it's like a sponge, it's like a filter. It cleans your water before the water flows out of springs, down tributaries, and into the river. This is northern Wisconsin, and you can see just from looking around here, it's not an aerial photo, but you can see that's a pretty heavily forested watershed. So really clean water. I grew up around clean water and lots of wildlife. Again, this is an island. 75% of the island stuck back into a big wetland. So there's just all kinds of wildlife. And I grew up around that wildlife, and really that was my beginning in ecology. It wasn't textbook ecology. It was learning from the animals and watching the dragonfly, crawl out and shed their skins and become big predators, and also just prey to and food source for other animals. The great blue herons standing in the marsh, the turtles. Oh man, I'm such a turtle guy, and I come by it naturally. My family were not big fishermen. My parents didn't teach me how to fish. They taught me how to catch turtles. And my dad was a turtle guy, and our son has, there's my dad with his 80th birthday cake, turtle cake. So yeah, my son has a 200-gallon turtle pond at the base of his bed. And yeah, we've learned a lot from the wise old turtle. Lots of beavers around. Beavers are the architect of nature. They're keystone species. We all know about beaver dams. And I highly encourage you to watch the beaver talk that's coming up as part of this series. So I'm not going to get too into beavers, but these wetland ecosystems are just, they provide a lot of ecosystem services, a lot of benefit for humans that we don't really even realize. So, beavers built these dams. It holds back sediment. It makes water spill over onto the landscape where it gets stored. It filters water. We're finding out that beavers are just have traditionally done a lot for our streams, which is generic for rivers or creeks, the term streams, but for our streams. And we're even starting to use what we call beaver dam analogs to sort of mimic the structures that beavers had and the services that they provided, like backing up water and helping to make incised streams less incised. And we'll get into what that means later. But beavers are the architects of nature. Here's an otter. We had otters around the island growing up. That was always really cool to see them. You had to get up pretty early. They usually came by right after sunrise. And the otters live in these holts, which is like their dens. They're often built in old beaver lodges, whether that's in the bank or in the lodge itself that's out. So pretty cool there that these beavers are even making habitats for other animals. And then, you know, difference between muskrats and otters and beavers. Otters are mustelids. They're closely related to a weasel. They're in the weasel family, wolverines, whatever, mink. And then, you know, beavers are big rodents and muskrats too. So otters actually eat muskrats, but eagles, oh man, so many eagles growing up just everywhere. They actually wake you up. They're pretty annoying. You're like, oh man, stupid eagles again. But lots of eagles. And, you know, eagles, bald eagles particularly eat fish. Golden eagles eat other stuff. But bald eagles are primarily eating fish and carrion. They want to be close to water. They want snags. So, you know, just so much wildlife, and it taught me a lot. Trout, not so much in our lakes, but in our streams. And here, you know, you can look up and you can see this trout looking up, waiting for a bug to fall in the water or seeing what else he can see. So, you know, what do all these animals need? Why are there so many animals around in these really natural places? And why do we get to enjoy their company? And it's because, you know, of the habitat. And habitat is basically food and shelter. It's structure and composition, structure being vertical and composition being the dynamic mix of it all. So, and all that either gives them a place to find shelter from the heat or the cold, or from a predator, or to hide, to be a predator. And then it also provides the same thing for all the things they eat, the food, and it gives them a place to hunt for food and hide so they don't become food. So all animals, I just want you to keep that, all our little buddies need habitat, food, shelter, and it needs to be in the form of structure and composition. That's important. But let's back up to what we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about where streams come from. So we already talked about a watershed really briefly here. And a watershed, you know, has this dividing drainage, and it leads to an ocean or a lake, depending on the scale of your watershed. You have springs where the water at the high altitude goes into the soil and pops out and starts a river. Tributaries means one stream comes into another stream. So you can see the stream comes into the original one that came out of the spring. At the point where they come together, that's the confluence. And then at the very end, there's a delta. And just keep this in mind. You see all those little islands and how it's kind of braided? It's not just one main channel. We'll get back to that. And that would be the mouth of a river as it comes into the ocean or a lake. So here's a watershed on the left. It's, you know, you can actually see the whole watershed on this one stream. And then you can see another tributary coming in. So that'd be another watershed. And it's all part of a bigger watershed. And I just have another slide I stole from somebody showing, you know, it kind of catches the water and shoots it out like a bathtub. This is a watershed that's close to Missoula, Montana. This is the Swan River. So on the left, you can see the Mission Mountains up there. The Mission Mountains make one side of the bathtub. This is actually most of the watershed in the valley there. And then on the right come the Swan Mountains. Behind that ridge starts the Bob Marshall Wilderness, one of the biggest wilderness complexes in the lower 48s in North America. So you can see the whole stream there. And then this watershed is delineated based on the highest elevation, where it's going to tip one way or another. Here's another watershed right by Missoula, Montana. This is the Rattlesnake watershed. So the little blue line I drew in there is basically Rattlesnake Creek. And then this yellow line defines the high points around it. So any water that hits within those yellow lines eventually makes its way down to the Rattlesnake Creek, which goes right into Missoula and out the Clark Fork River. Here's another look, just looking at a more of a raised relief topo, shaded relief in this case, map that shows the Rattlesnake watershed again, right in Missoula. And this is, there's actually a rattlesnake wilderness. So Missoula is one of the closest towns to wilderness area, or cities in the country. So that's pretty cool. Now this one's kind of fun. This is the Clark Fork watershed. So we were looking at the Swan watershed, which is right here. And then the little Rattlesnake watershed, which would be right here. And it shows other watersheds coming in. They all flow out and they flow to Lake Pend Oreille, which is right by Sandpoint, Idaho, where I said Gretchen and I lived right after we got married. And after that, it flows out into the Priest River. this is some Mylar data that you can look at the elevation. So here again is that Swan watershed. The orange is a low spot. And here's our little rattlesnake watershed. Actually, here's our little rattlesnake watershed. So you can see the low spots are where these rivers come together and flow out. And this is a way that we capture science, capture elevation to use for science and restoration and things like that. And then I mentioned all the watersheds are tiered. So, you know, we looked at the rattlesnake and the Swan are both in the Clark Fork watershed. And then the Clark Fork watershed's in the Columbia watershed in the Columbia Basin, which drains right into the Pacific Ocean. So that's your watersheds. What happens in your watershed really affects your water. And it's just a good geographic way to sort of do some land management planning. So one of the big things that happens with streams is we have erosion. And erosion is just the removal of material. It could be from wind, it could be from your shoe. In this case, we're going to be talking about water as the agent for erosion. So water can erode a river's channel, and it erodes the material, and it becomes what we call the eroded material becomes what we call the bed load, or the load in this case. First, the load. Get to the bed load in a minute. So the load gets transported by the river. And here's a picture. You can see big erosion. You know, the erosion mostly happens at the bottom, but then you get what's called calving, where the top falls off. So the bed load is the heavy sediments on the gravel, the rock, even small boulders that travel along the bottom of a stream bed. And as they move, they're either moving from traction or saltation. They're either bouncing or grinding along, and they become more rounded as they move. And that's why you see all these rounded river rocks. And if you're like when we lived in northern Wisconsin, even though it's mostly sand, you dig down after a while, you come to some big rounded rocks. Those were moved around by streams back in the glacial days in the Ice Age. And now they're buried in the middle of a forest. So if you dig down deep enough and you find rounded rock, you realize that there was a lot of water movement there. If you find big angular rock, it probably hasn't been through that system. It's probably bedrock that's degrading somehow or being uplifted by tectonic movement or something like that. So this is just a little diagram here that shows that there's two layers to the stream. Basically, there's the suspended load, that's often your silts and clays, and your bed load. And so you either have material that's been dissolved and is carried along, and this could be chemicals too, but it could be minerals or something like that, or just carried because they're small enough that, and the water's fast enough that it can actually carry this material, and it's the suspended load. And then down at the bottom, you have that bed load that's grinding, hopping, bouncing, but staying pretty low and close to the bottom. And you can also see that some of the smallest material is sort of working like when the Egyptians moved those great big rocks back in the day. They put them on little rocks or logs to roll them along. And that's kind of what some of the rocks do on the bottom. Everybody on there is getting rounder and rounder as they go along. So there's traction, which is the rolling on the bottom. There's saltation, which is hopping along. There's suspension, where you're being carried. And then there's solution, where you're actually dissolved. You're chemically dissolved into the water. And here in the top, you've probably all seen it if you've ever been around a river in flood season, or if somebody's just monkeying around a lot in the watershed, you might see a lot of sediment in that watershed. And here's a big plume of sediment coming in from a tributary entering a clean stream. And then there's your bigger bed load on the bottom. So, all right, we know that erosion happens and we know that stuff gets carried along, but how does that, like, where does it start? And it starts in the higher places, right? And certainly when you have mountains, you drop pretty quickly. So the water's moving really fast. And so as it moves fast, it cuts a V-shaped valley. It's moving down fast, it's eroding deep, but it's not moving back and forth a lot. It's like a toboggan chute, just trying to get down. As you come off the mountain and the mountain begins to flatten, you get a wider stream channel, and you start to get some floodplain in there. But the water's still moving pretty fast, picking up more tributaries as different watersheds come together. Then you get to the bottom of like a valley bottom. And so Missoula Valley or the Bozeman Valley, places where we are here, they're pretty big valleys with a lot of flat land. Like there's something like 70,000 people, 80,000 people living in the bottom of the Missoula Valley. So when the water gets down there and gets flat, it slows way down, but it's collected all this water. So as the stream goes by, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's going slower and slower and slower. And because it's going slower, it starts to drop some of that suspended load, and it starts to build up that bed load even more. And you can see we also develop a big floodplain where it's pretty flat. So if the water spills over, there's no little V channel to keep it in its channel. It's getting out there on the landscape. The most common feature we see as it hops down these elevations are steps and pools. Steps could be anything from impervious rock, some sort of vein from geology that hasn't worn away where pools have, or it could be a log that hops it. So the pools are your deeper parts. They're going to have more oxygen when it gets hot and the water doesn't carry as much oxygen. And then actually usually over the step, it kind of bubbles and adds some of that oxygen into the system. So here, you can see by looking at the bank off to the side, we're in a pretty high elevation channel. We're up at the top of the mountain, but you see your steps and pools. You got a little step pop in there, and you're more of a pool system down there. Look at all that wood too. Keep that in mind. This is up in the national forest, pretty high up. So yeah, we talked about how the water comes down fast, comes down to a chute. It's a V shape. We get in here, it has a little more floodplain. It starts to slow down, it starts to meander or wiggle, swivel back and forth a little bit. And then at the bottom, it really starts to break off and get some meandering to it, to squiggle back and forth, a little wiggle in it. You can see these little lakes or side channels next to it. And then this delta type formation at the very bottom. And that's because as it drops its sediment, it might actually block its own way. And so it overflows the next year and cuts a new channel. And then towards the end of flood season, because as the snow melts, you got a lot more water moving through the system. But as it moves into summer, you dry out a little bit. So you lose speed, you lose the ability to carry as much, and that bed load drops off and might block the channel again. And then the channel next time it comes up has to pop over a new way. So these are all separate little channels. And sometimes that can be really big. Like in the Missoula Valley, a creek like Grant Creek probably never flowed all the way to the Clark Fork. It was probably braided across the whole valley bottom with those little channels. And only on big snow years did it ever have a primary channel that flowed all year round for something like bull trout to migrate in the fall. Here's a mid elevation. This is actually a restoration. You can see it hasn't been planted, but the steps in the pools are built right in. Here's some of that braiding at the bottom of a delta. And you can just imagine, when it's really roaring, you probably have that whole area covered by water. But as it starts to drop all that fine sediment, it clogs itself and it has to find new ways out. And there's also pulses. It's not like there's one big flood and then it doesn't have any water for the year. You might have a big rain event and the water picks back up. These rivers are really dynamic. They're constantly changing. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what goes along with rivers. There's what we call the riparian area, and that's sort of the transition between the aquatic area and the upland area. And it can be wetlands, it can be plants that are very tolerant of having their feet wet, their roots wet part of the time without dying. And it's a really important area. It's what I spend a lot of my time working on and teaching people about and trying to get them to manage it better, because it's so essential for so many things. And we'll get into that a little bit too. But before we get into that, I just want to make sure we really understand these principles. So when we talk about water moving fast, we're talking about what we call the velocity. And the velocity is just how fast the water moves through the channel. And typically the way we talk about that is in cubic feet per second, or CFS. You may have heard that term. So cubic feet per second is simply a foot by a foot by a foot, like this little cube. I like to think of it as one of those little glass aquariums. They're not quite a foot by a foot by a foot, but they're pretty close. How many of those are flying past a line across the river, if you were to stand at the river in any 1 second. And you guys know when you're measuring area or volume, you look at depth and width, and then the distance. And here it's a second in this case. So that's a cubic foot by second. That's the velocity. But streams are rounded, so we have to kind of break them into these little chunks so we can do the math and figure out how many cubic feet per second are cruising by, because it's pretty interesting and important for engineers and floodplain managers and all sorts of people to know the velocity of the stream. So we break it into these little angular shapes rather than a smooth shape. Well, how do we do that? You run a line, you get 2 people, you make sure you're working at the same elevation. Somebody surveys in a level on a stick. Now they have lasers and things too. And you measure it all the way across, and you get all these different measurements. So here we have 1.8, 2, 4, 4, 6. And then you make an average of that, and you get your cubic feet per second, or velocity of the stream, and the volume of water it's moving. But water moves different ways in different parts of the stream. And I don't know, if anybody's looking for a name for their dog, I highly recommend Thalwag. Thalwag is the fastest moving part of the stream, but Tholly would be a good dog's name. And you guys probably know from spinning a tire or whipping a string around, something on the end of a radius goes a lot faster than in the middle of the hub, and that's true with water. So as we're looking on the diagram on the left, you can see area B has those different sized arrows, and the small arrows mean that the water is going slower than the big arrows. So you look at cross section A, and they're all about the same. The ones on the side are a little smaller. And if we were in live session, I would ask you to tell me why that is, but I'll tell you guys. That's because it has friction with the sides of the channel here. And so just keep that in mind. Now let's move over. We're going to flip-flop. So A is at the top. The fastest flow, or the Thalwag, is kind of right in the middle, where it's not making contact with the sides. It's got the most buffer. It's moving fast and free. But on the outside bend, the Thalwag is going to move to the outside. It's going to be deeper, and it's going to be faster on the outside bend. And just keep that little yellow area in mind right there. There's a little yellow area growing right there. What's that about? So here's another way to measure Thalwags, or to illustrate Thalwags. These are just ISO lines that show, how many, in this case, I think is meters per second, the water is moving here, but just shows you basically that the Thalwag on a curve will be more kicked out to that deep outer side. All right, so we talked about the stream's load, all that stuff it's carrying, and now we talked about where water is moving fastest, and we talked about erosion. So as the water is moving down the stream, we see that it kind of ping-pongs its way down. That dark blue line hits those yellow spots and then crosses the stream. This is actually the way I like to drive through mountain passes. I like to switch in back and forth between lanes if there's no traffic. But every time it's on the outside, that water's moving fastest. And in this case, the yellow, it's different than that last slide. In this case, the yellow is a point of erosion. That water's moving fast enough. It's constantly scraping away, which means that river is going to continue to grow that way. It's going to grow out to where those nick points are at the corners. But on the inside, where it's kind of brownish, clayish, reddish here, the water's moving slower. So the bed load gets dropped on those inside points. So that part grows out to chase the curve that's reaching away. And that's what you call a point bar. And so the longer the stream's meandering along the landscape, the curvier, the more sinuous it will become because of these deposits and this erosion. There's your little Thalwag cross section. And it shows the point of erosion and the point of deposition. That's on this line A to B here, that cross section. All right, so here's our landscape. Fastest flowing water is the dark blue. Oh, we see our points of erosion, bouncing to the other side, points of erosion, bouncing again, points of erosion. And in the meantime, these deposition or point bars are being built up and continuing to grow out. And then introducing in this slide a floodplain. So this is the area where if the water spills over, it ends up pouring out onto here. Here's a photo. Sorry, they're so grainy. I have a nice big screen, so it looks pretty grainy to me. But you can see the whole floodplain delineated in yellow. That's sort of the top part before the water would really have to have a Noah's Ark flood to get out into the forest. But all that land, that farmland out there, that pretty flat land, is probably going to get flooded in what we call a 100-year flood, which means there's a 1% chance every year, or is that right? I think that's right. Or 10% chance every 10 years, or a 100% chance every 100 years. But that's a hard thing to say because there's never a 100% chance, really. So that's called your floodplain, and that's when it spills over the bank. But you can see your point bars here, and you can see your meanders and where you'd be digging. And so here's a point bar. Now, one of the interesting things is it comes around this outside curve. It looks like there's a big mountain of bedrock. This is not very erodible. So that's going to confine the channel. But on the other side, you can see before it hit that, it does have this depositional point bar. That point bar probably gets flooded at some times. There's not trees there. You know, it's probably underwater some of the time. And what happens when you're underwater some of the time? Well, the landscape, acts like a sponge. When that area is underwater some of the time, it soaks up all that water. And as the water recedes, like in this photo, if you were going to dig a hole under Mr. SpongeBob there, the soil is going to be a lot wetter. It's going to be saturated, where it won't probably be up in this forest, and it certainly won't be on this big granite cliff over here. So these point bars are really important because they give water back to the system in August. Out here in the West, it stops raining, in June, and we get pretty hot and dry in August, and the rivers are way down. But this landscape can actually keep giving water back. And man, years ago, our conservation district's 80 years old this year. So we started in 1946, right after World War II. They were just discovering nitrogen fertilizers. We didn't have a great system for feeding our whole country. Food was actually a big expense for people. Not that many people were able to put much fat on their bodies. We used to spend a lot more money on food and a lot less money on medicine. Anyway, conservation districts used to help landowners figure out how to channelize their land to make sure the floodplains didn't get activated so they can farm on these areas, these marginal areas. And we just tried to get this water out of our landscape as fast as we can and to the Pacific Ocean. Just get it out of here. We don't want it. We don't want to farm with that. So that's what we used to spend our money on. Now we do projects like this. This was actually, we didn't fund this one, but this is 9 Mile Creek. And this is a project Trout Unlimited did. And they put the squiggle back in after this was straightened from mining and some farming up in the 9 Mile. So it shows that sinuosity, which two things are happening here. Not only do they have activated floodplains, which you can't tell from this aerial, but as you move back and forth, it's actually storing a lot more water in the landscape just because a straight line is shorter than a wiggly line. So there's a lot more water held on this, let's just call it a mile of river, than if it were a straight line. All right, I got to get moving. So in this is a floodplain map. The pink area is your floodplain for a 100-year flood, and the red area is what you call floodway. And so the pink area in a flood might have something that spills outside the bank and only be an inch long. You wouldn't want a basement there. You don't want your house there really, because you're going to get saturated and everything's going to get moldy. But that floodway, that dark red area, you might have a pine tree coming down at 30 miles an hour. And if your house were in that area, that's outside of the bank, it's going to be ripped off its foundation and knocked away. So sometimes you can build something in the floodplain, but you can never really build anything in the floodway. So as we have these flooding events and these meanderings, we eventually get so wide that we have what's called an avulsion. An avulsion is when at the flood stage, the flood comes up and it makes a new, more efficient channel. It finds a path of least resistance. And then it also deposits some stuff blocking itself from the old channel. So you get remnant side channels or remnant channels or oxbow lakes, and you've probably seen those from airplanes. So here we see on the bottom right, the meander depositing sediment. Suddenly we have an avulsion. Next thing you know, we have a new channel that's straightening itself out again and an old oxbow lake. We can actually study this stuff and make channel migration zone maps, which are super handy for land use planning and for protecting people. This one is down in Frenchtown, Montana, which is the far end of the Missoula Valley, the western end. So you can see here the yellow is erosion hazard areas. That's where the Clark Fork River is most likely to nick. Those pinkish areas are where it's most likely to have an avulsion and become the new straight channel. So here the channel kind of comes like this currently, but there might be an avulsion and it comes right through here. I actually work with this rancher who's hoping that doesn't happen because he could lose a lot of his land. But people ask me where the Clark Fork's going to stop. It took 10 feet of my property last year. And I always say, are you talking 5 years, 500 years, 5,000 years, 5 million years? Because the Clark Fork River has been back and forth across the whole Missoula Valley, miles and miles sideways, dropping that bed load, which makes for a real porous landscape that we're sitting on that stores water in all those little cracks below, which is one reason, though, it's pretty arid here, but we have a great aquifer underneath the Clark Fork. Here's that same area without the channel migration zone. So you can see all those old side channels and oxbow lakes, and just illustrates the point I was just making. That Clark Fork River has been all over this landscape from way before, certainly before European descendants were in the Missoula Valley. All right, so let's go back to the riparian zone and this alluvium deposit. Now we talked about how that bed load's just been deposited back and forth and built up. So yeah, all those round rocks are below channels quite often. So you have your aquatic area, which is the channel between the two banks, and you have this riparian zone, and then it transfers into upland. And the vegetation sort of is on a spectrum through there usually too, with things that can handle real wet feet to things that can't handle being wet at all in the upland zone. This is maybe a more illustrated picture. You also have the flood prone elevation here. So you can see that, all these guys might be flooded for a while up on this top line. And so that might be like a cottonwood here or something that can handle that, even aspen. A lot of times ponderosa are right on the edge of the floodplain or even in the floodplain, but on the 100-year floodplain, not on the 10-year floodplain. And then you have a bank full elevation, which is the highest the water could get before it spills over into the floodplain. Those are pretty much the takeaways in this one. So a real healthy riparian area is just filled with vegetation, and that's working as a filter. It has an extensive root system. Those roots go down and they stabilize the bank. And that really helps hold everything together. So you can see here on the left is rainfall. There's a grass strip around this house. There's runoff, which is reduced. So there's two things water is going to do. It's either going to do overland flow and flow across the surface. Like if you're in a parking lot, you're going to see like a little river going towards the drain, or it's going to soak into the ground, or both. And then it could also stick on the leaves and be evaporated off the leaves, or evapotranspirated from the soil up out of the plant. So as it runs across, though, it gets filtered a bit here, and that's really important to the plants and to the storing that water and having us have clean water by the time it discharges into the water body. You can imagine if someone was using herbicides or pesticides of any kind, insecticides, you don't want that stuff to get into your water and kill all the stuff the trout eat. So that riparian buffer is pretty essential. And I've seen research saying a riparian buffer should be anywhere from 30 feet to 328 feet in a recent article I read, depending on what you're trying to keep out of your streams. Not to mention hold the streams together with their roots and shade the stream, or have wood fall into the stream, which we call wood recruitment, so that you start to have some habitat in that stream. Remember, we need that structure and that composition. So this is all, the riparian area provides all that. And I'm mostly talking about aquatic creatures, but it's also great for terrestrial creatures, which I don't focus on, because if I said that with the law that I regulate, it would be a misuse of the law. But certainly, you know, riparian areas are great for migration corridors, or just corridors across the landscape for animals, and then birds. Everybody uses riparian areas. Here's a pretty healthy looking riparian area. There's a little trail pretty close to the stream, but you can see all those willows holding the bank together. The stream's kind of low here. Looks like we're in one of those higher mountain streams just based on the V-shaped landscape there. This is a great one because on the right we have cheatgrass, which has been plaguing the West since the 1800s. It doesn't grow very deep roots. It's pretty bad. Next we have Kentucky bluegrass, which everyone likes to plant in their lawn. They actually illustrate that it's kind of forms a sod there and connects, but still not very good roots. This is 30 centimeters or about 1 foot. Then we go to our native sedges and rushes, and they're down there, you know, getting past that 1 foot mark. And then we get to the willows, where they're really, really stable as that stream floods and moves across the landscape. You can see those roots are actually what's holding it together. If you just have cheatgrass, you're going to lose that soil as the water moves across it. It's not going to be a armor against erosion. This is from a lake, but it's the same thing as a stream. You have your open water. Sometimes you have floating or submergent vegetation. You go into emergent vegetation. Then you have your wet-footed riparian area, and then you have your upland. So that's where the habitat really is. And, you know, I like to say this is the furniture. It's funny where I put my mouse changes what I can see on my screen, but that's the furniture that makes the habitat for the wildlife. So here's a place, you know, a lot of times I get calls from people who say, oh, a tree fell in the creek, I got to move it out, like I got to get a permit to cut it out. And I work with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in Montana, and they say, no, you don't, you know, and we say, no, you don't. I mean, I've learned to say, no, you don't. That's part of the stream. That's the furniture in the house, right? Look at this. There's a nice deep pool, lots of furniture in the house over there. That looks like a great place to go fishing. Oh, look at that. That's where the little guys hang out. Whether they're picking little bugs off that are growing in there, or they're hiding from the bigger fish or the osprey or the eagle. And then the bugs too, they need habitat, right? And they need rocks, and they don't want to be silted out. So these are all, this is stonefly and some caddisflies. And this is, I've been talking about this for like 25 years. When I used to do a lot of lake work, I would always telling people, don't mow down to the river and take away all the furniture out of the house. Your house is still there. Yeah, oh, I love the lake. I love the river. That's why I mow it so much and fertilize it so much, because I love to sit out here with my lemonade or beer or whatever you're into and just appreciate it, but they're destroying it. So when we moved here, my wife Gretchen hadn't come yet, and she was still finishing up her job, and I moved out with the kids with no furniture, and she was packing up the whole house. Thank you very much, Gretchen, forever. But we had no furniture, and so you can see the dog beds were actually in pretty high demand. I mean, we had a house, but it didn't function like a house is supposed to function, and it really drove home the point. So I took this picture. I was like, oh my gosh, I've been talking about this forever. Now I'm living it, living on the mowed lawn. Here's a project. This was actually rehabbed, but not yet when we took this picture. This used to be in someone's yard. You can see this faucet here, and that was like back in the middle of a yard for horses to drink out of, but the river nicked it away, and they didn't have any good vegetation cover, and so everything just eroded. Here's another one. This is just a local trail where you can see all the roots, but boy, people hike it so much. So this is pretty high water. This is right in Missoula. And yeah, flood stage where people have trampled a lot of the vegetation. It's not holding together like it is on other parts of the bank. And it's not like you need to remove all that vegetation to enjoy nature. It's not like, oh my gosh, a spider touched me or anything. You can get out there, enjoy it more. In fact, my turtle catching son caught his most beautiful turtle ever on this trip. He was blown away. So, but there's a lot going on in these watersheds, and you know, you can look at the two different sides here. One has a healthy riparian area where people fenced off their animals, and the riparian area has plants in it. And the other, they let them graze. And man, I saw some bad ones today up Butler Creek. Whew, pretty tough when you just keep animals fenced in the riparian area. And that's all some people have, but it does a lot of damage. I should have taken pictures of that. That would be too embarrassing. This is a place that was overgrazed, and actually in that channel migration zone area. So the rancher that's hoping the river doesn't take this over is also not keeping the cattle out. So he has no cottonwoods or anything else that can kind of hold this together. So he's losing prime real estate, and real estate in Montana is expensive. And adding all this sediment to flush out or flood out or smother out those little bugs we were just showing and the trout, and it's not a good deal. Not to mention make the water warmer and hold less oxygen. So once you start grazing, you know, let's say this is our natural system. You can see the water table kind of comes down and then hits a place where it connects. Remember old SpongeBob was in here and he's dripping over into the stream. But if you graze it a lot, what happens is you get head cutting and you get these steep banks like we saw in the last picture with the stream kind of lower, and the water table actually sinks down. So if you're growing hay or something and you let your animals do this, you're losing your natural irrigation for your crops and lowering that water table, and just causing a whole bunch of problems for the system. So here's another example where we start off with a water table. This one's actually, the last one was a gaining reach. This one, the stream's losing to the land near it, but same thing. But you can see, like, it wouldn't take much for the stream to go over its banks and start to soak into this floodplain. But this bottom one, boy, it would take a lot of water. It would take a lot of those cubes we were talking about before the water could come over and activate that floodplain. And so, you know, how's Mr. SpongeBob going to do his thing when he's not activated, when he never gets the water soaked into him? So he can't really do it. And it gets more and more in size because the tops start calving off like we saw before, until it gets so wide that it actually gets a new riparian area in size. It's in size channel. So I'm going to kind of boogie. Here's an example of that overgrazed inside channel starting to fall off, where it's going to develop new plants and stuff in there. Here's another incised channel. This is Adam from the Clark Fork Coalition and Brian from my office checking out a project. So we can do some restoration of this. And when you do that, you activate the floodplain. You pull these incised banks back so that during flood stage, not 100-year flood events, but you have some area for that bank to collect that water and store it. So here's an area. There's actually Gretchen and our chairman, Tim, and Lad Notek from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, looking at this area that's pretty incised. And so this was a restoration Gretchen did with the Clark Fork Coalition. Here's how they pulled that bank back, and they built a permanent fence to keep the livestock out of the stream. These are waterers and plantings, but you can see that now the water can pour over and sit in this area and soak up like a sponge during the high months. There's another same farm, but they just made sure that riparian area is fenced off. And, you know, this isn't the highest quality vegetation on this side, but it's vegetation. So before and after, you know, big steep banks, lack of vegetation, and here's a restoration on the same place. So that's going to be a stable bank, less prone to erosion, and just good habitat. And these restorations can be big. They peel back the banks. They collect these willow cuttings, thousands of them. They put them in down where their feet are going to be wet when they put the bank back on. They add coarse woody debris or large woody debris in there. So there's structure, there's furniture for the critters. Just another riparian area. This is actually not great high quality vegetation either. And you can see some erosion under here because a lot of this is non-native vegetation. Here's a little stream. You know, they're not all great big streams. Some of them are pretty small, but you can see that deep part. Here would be more of your point bar, and then same thing over here. Here's knapweed, and more invasive species, and just doesn't have the same root structure as those natives, so it's still calving off here. Here's somebody who, you know, really loved the stream. They loved it and made sure no dandelions grew near it. But every time it rained, all these herbicides and chemicals go into that. And they even have riprap here, which really is bad for the stream. One, it ping pongs that velocity down to the next person, so they have more chance of eroding. And two, it really doesn't provide a lot of structure compared to what they were doing with that large woody debris and all those willow cuttings. So it's a practice we've gotten away from in Missoula County. More riprap. Here, this was right after a storm, so we were getting wood recruitment, but you can see here, this is kind of an ill-managed riparian area. Just another example of what not to do. So you can see there's structure starting down here, but this area is all mowed and doesn't have any furniture in the house. So in Montana, we have what's called the Natural Streambed and Land Preservation Act of 1975, also known as the 310 Law. Weird things, there's conservation districts in almost every county in the United States. Some even have two. As far as I know, only in Montana do we have any regulatory authority. So if you want to do some work near a stream, it doesn't actually have a distance in the law, but we say if you're going to work within 50 feet, come talk to us, talk about getting this permit. It's reviewed really quickly, and it allows us to say, hey, well, you don't need to cut out that dead tree that fell. You can leave it, or what's the compromise? Oh, there's a dead tree in your yard, but you have a shed there. It's going to fall in the shed. Like, let's take that one down, but you got to plant 3 more new ones for tomorrow. So, you know, we want people to stop having landscapes like this. This is just kind of a real pre and post development slide of what happens with that runoff. And the take home message here is that in the pre-development one, a lot of that precipitation, thank you, sorry, goes into the ground or evaporates, and less than 1% becomes surface runoff. But in the post-development, where you have all these impervious surfaces, you know, 20 to 30% ends up as runoff. So even if you don't have a 310 law, you can still have best management practices wherever you live. This is actually, I think, from Minnesota. And you can leave a buffer zone. You don't need to have green lawn right down to the edge. You can also turn things a little bit so there's not a straight shot for water. If it is flowing off your lawn, it gets absorbed somewhere. This is just a great picture from Holland Lake of furniture in the house. It's really hard to see, but my cursor is pointing right at a loon nest. And then over here is a pile of turtles. So they're all using that furniture. If that log hadn't fallen there, if someone was like, oh, the log's messy, let's keep it out, then we would have no furniture, and that loon wouldn't be there and those turtles wouldn't be there. So there's a lot going on in our developed watersheds. We got to contend with a lot. It's not like that forested watershed I showed you originally. There's homes, there's factories, there's agriculture, and as water runs out of these things, it doesn't always get filtered, and we got to keep that in mind. Just more pictures of, you know, this one on the far left didn't do such a good job keeping a riparian buffer. I've seen worse. We've seen worse in this presentation. But you can see some of the people down below said, yeah, we're going to let the willows stay there. We don't want our houses eroded. These are some trees. This would be a case where people said, well, you know, these trees really could crush our little tent cabin, so we would like to take those out. Maybe that's fair, but it would sure be nice to have them in the stream for habitat. This is just a bad choice that someone decided to build this infrastructure right next to the Clark Fork River. Look at it now. Now we got a big problem. So that's why floodplain and other agencies don't really allow this kind of development anymore. I do have this healthy riparian guide that's on our website. I can throw that link in the comments if anybody wants it. And I'll do that at the end. Or if you're in Missoula, you can pick up a copy. It's really good. We have the older copy online, so it doesn't talk about permitting per se, but it has lots of good stuff in it. A lot of my slides came from this guide. We get out there and we teach school children with this water table that's owned by the Montana Association of Conservation Districts, teach them how different things happen on the landscape. This moose got eroded. Here's just another picture of some of our native vegetation versus lawns and how deep these roots can go. Here's someone who was mowing their lawn and starting to lose their property um, because they wanted this little chill out spot and they weren't letting the native vegetation grow next to the riparian area. This is a creek where that property they're losing is really valuable. So we gave them a grant to do a little riparian planting. It wasn't a huge restoration, but they brought that across the front. Hopefully they'll need to back off on their chill out area, but hopefully they won't lose their property. This is a great one. This is the Highlander Brewery. And boy, this is right on Grant Creek. They had all these Adirondack chairs and people would like to bring them and put their feet in the water, but they're riparian. They had no riparian vegetation other than this corridor of this old gallery of cottonwoods, but the gallery started to sort of biodegrade as they do and break off and fall apart. So they were getting scared their customers were going to get hurt. So they asked if they could cut them down. And the agreement we came to is they were going to top them off and make snags out of a lot of them. The real healthy ones that were leaning away from the people they were going to keep. But more than that, here's some of the different angle on that. This might have even been some of the first ones they cut. And what they offered to do was we put together a little team with the Conservation District, the Clark Fork Coalition, Trees for Tomorrow, and then the Highlander Brewery themselves. And they were willing to fence off this amenity that their public liked so much and do this restoration. And it's really helped the bank there. And I just can't say enough good things. When you have landowners who say, wow, and we know we're going to have pushback, but we're willing to do this because right is right. And you can see here all the topped snags of the trees they had that weren't going to land in their parking lot. So that's pretty much it for my river talk. This is the land where I spent my summers and grew up. This is the land where it's back in northern Wisconsin. It's funny coming to Montana. Whenever you're a transplant anywhere, people question you. Who are you to come to my land and tell me what to do or suggest that I could do it better? And I don't know. We've been at it a while on this northern Wisconsin property. This property is old enough that this would no longer be able to be built as close as it is. But this is how our family's been managing our land since the 40s. And this is, if you go around the corner, how the neighbors are managing their land, which is actually illegal, but you don't want to turn in your neighbors and it's hard to enforce. But yeah, that's not looking so good. And, so when people ask me like, well, how can you be born in Chicago and know anything at all? This is a little restoration Gretchen and I did. This used to be a boathouse, and that's actually the back of the island. But the boathouse was falling down. It was a bad place for it. It filled with muck all the time. So yeah, we did that by hand. That was pretty cool. That was my only first restoration. And this is a place I'd love to restore. This is downtown Chicago. This is actually an award-winning Army Corps of Engineers project. This is the Chicago Lakefront. And don't get me wrong, it's super fun. There's millions and millions of people who use it. So what are you going to do? But there's not a lot of habitat there. There's not a lot of furniture in the house. It's not really functioning. And so when people say like, how can you come in? I can't blame them. Like, look at that. Look at where I live. But here's what it used to look like. This is what it looks like just down the lakeshore when you get out of the city. So it can happen to you too, wherever you are. If you don't take good care, if you think, oh, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. It slips up on you. Let's just take out this tree. Let's just add this lawn. Let's put in this beach. Why don't we put in that staircase? And next thing you know, you're here and you got no furniture in your house. And so I guess I'll end with that. Like, we shouldn't say, oh, these other areas are bad and let's not learn from them. We should learn from them and realize what good we have and how much we should strive to protect it, whether it's through regulation or just our own best management practice, and consider regulation that safety net that catches us when we've just gone too far. So, oh wow, I have a whole series. There you go. Okay. So that's it. That's if you ever want to reach out to me, that's my contact info. And I really appreciate people being here. And I don't know if we're going to do some questions or
Yeah. Rad, thank you so much. That was such a comprehensive presentation. Really interesting. Yeah, we're kind of
Thank
just
you.
at about time here. Not sure if anyone has a quick question they want to throw into the chat. Don't want to keep everyone. I know it's getting later, but yeah, if anyone has a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. Got a question from Ian Bailey. For restoring a riparian area, is it important to have a variety of vegetation that have different root lengths for holding the banks together, or is it best to have the longest roots? Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And I'll make up an answer for you. I would say focus on the longest roots, but I think you'll get the shallower roots anyway. But the real thing to do is look at what's called a reference reach. So you try to find the most natural reach in that same system you're working on and say, what should this look like? And you want to try to mimic that same vegetation. So you might have a native species that's in a different county or on the other side of the divide or something. Try to use the most local stuff because from a natural area. So ecologists and restoration ecologists go to what they call a reference reach and mimic that. Willows are great. They grow really well. They're affordable. Restoration is really expensive too. So it's a combination of all. But if you start with the deep rooted, you'll end up having soils and other things will migrate into.
Awesome. And then we've got one more question from Deb. What is the typical setback from creeks and rivers around Missoula County? Is there a legal distance?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So for the longest time, the only law protecting, and this is true for most of Montana, protecting any stream is the Montana Natural Streambed and Land Preservation Act, at least on private property. In Missoula County, there's a portion of our county that's zoned. I'm going to guess it's about 20%. It's right around the greater Missoula city area. So 2-ish years ago, the city came out, or the county, I'm sorry, came out with a riparian resource protection ordinance. And I want to say that has regulation back as far as 150 feet. I think the main purpose of that is to look at new development and subdivisions, not go around and find old farms where somebody might have a fence within 150 feet. But so there's that ordinance, there's the floodplain ordinance. And if you're in a mapped floodplain, and not every floodplain's mapped, that's something that the Federal Emergency Management Association or organization or whatever their FEMA does. If you're in a mapped floodplain in Missoula County and it has a floodway, you need to have a 50-foot vegetated buffer, unmanipulated of native vegetation. So that's a floodplain ordinance. So now we have, and they're a division of the county planning. So we have 2 in the county. Then the city, if you're inside the city, there's the city buffer. And that's a lot smaller, but they're just rewriting their codes. And actually, I think they're going to try to line up with the county, partly because sometimes things that were in the county get annexed into the city, and we don't want to see any riparian areas reduced. And then our board tends not to take jurisdiction on anything greater than 50 feet away. So that's why I kind of tell people, if you're going to do something within 50 feet, let's talk. But our law, the Montana Natural Streambed and Land Preservation Act, doesn't actually have a footage. It just says that the intent of the law by the legislature back in 1975 was to keep streams in their natural state. So there's debate on that. And, what does it take to keep a stream in its natural state? I would say turn to the science. The science says it takes a riparian buffer that's at least 30 feet wide, if not 328 feet wide, to keep oxygen in the stream and sediment out of the stream and chemicals and wood recruitment, all these different things. So the 310 law can be pretty powerful, but we tend to just look at it as no more than 50 feet. If you're doing 50 feet of unmanipulated buffer, we're really happy. But that doesn't mean that you can't get a permit to do some other work in there. So I think I covered the big ones. The only other one that I really know about is with forestry. They have the streamside management zone, which is, again, 50 feet. So there's a lot of regulation on how much you can harvest. If you're doing a commercial timber sale on private property, you need to get a forester and a logger would need to follow the streamside management zone laws, which, and none of these preempt each other. You can have overlapping. You could have to follow floodplain laws, the 310 law, the county riparian resource law, and the streamside management zone, if depending on what you're doing. So it's not an easy question, but good question, Deb.
Absolutely. All right. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put on my little ending screen here. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Rad, for an awesome presentation. And yeah, for
Thank
anyone
you.
who's interested, we've got more awesome webinars coming up this year. Our next one is in April, and it's on plant phenology and the science of seasonal change. So we hope to see you guys all there.
Thanks for
All
Hey,
right,
coming.
I'm going to
guys.
quickly throw this thing in the chat too, that link I promised everybody. So if anybody wants to grab it, it'll be there for the ages too. Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate this. And thanks everyone for attending. It was really nice to have all you. I look so much for, I'm going to attend the next one. I can't wait.
Awesome.
Thanks, Rad. Bye, guys.
All right. Thanks. Bye, everybody.